thank you to Kindred for inviting me again to this year's conference. Obviously, sorry that we can't all be together and be face to face. So here I am doing another pre-record. Today, I'm going to be talking about the evaluation and efficacy of using responsible gambling tools. And I'm particularly going to be talking about the use of real world data and how this data can be used to analyze how effective the responsible gambling tools that are used by the gambling industry. If we look at the types of online responsible gambling tools that are out there, what I've got here is a list of what I think are the most commonly used by responsible gambling operators out there. So we've got mandatory play break. So for instance, I've been working with companies like Norsk Tipping that have had 90-second play breaks after, for instance, people have been playing for a continuous hour. We've got limit setting, and this can obviously be things like deposit limit setting, loss limit setting, time limit setting, many different types of limit setting that are used by operators. We've also got tools that can be looked at whether things like static or dynamic messaging helps people to change their gambling behavior in some way. We've got the instance of pop-up messaging, so people can often see pop-up messages come while they're actually gambling. I'm going to be talking today about messages that actually get people to try and stop their gambling. We've then got what I would call bespoke personalized messaging that is based on actual real-time playing behavior. We've got temporary self-exclusions, and obviously these can be for very short amounts of time, including 24 hours, a week, or even a month. And obviously there are some more permanent self-exclusions that might run to 6 months, a year, or even beyond that. And then we've got things like behavioral tracking tools. And when I talk about behavioral tracking tools, I'm talking about systems like PlayScan that was developed in Sweden by Svenska Spel, or Mentor, a system that was designed by myself and Michael Auer. So these are the main kinds of responsible gambling tools that are out there. And what I'm going to do briefly is talk about some studies that we've looked at evaluating mandatory play breaks. So we've done 2 of these studies. I've done 5 studies looking at the effects of various types of limit setting, and I'm going to briefly talk about the results of 4 of those studies today. I'm going to talk about 3 studies we've looked evaluating bespoke pop-up messaging, and I'm going to talk about 2 studies. I'm going to talk about 2 studies that have looked at pop-up messaging, 3 studies that have looked at personalized messaging, and then try and bring out some conclusions. Now, on the right of my screen here, there's a paper that we published back in 2017 that evaluated all the responsible gambling tools that had been done up to that point. But of course, some of the things I'm going to be talking about today have been published since that review was published. The first study I'm going to talk about, and I've talked about this so many times because this is the study that, when we first used behavioral tracking data, this was published way back in 2013. This was data provided to us by the Austrian gaming operator Win Today, and they gave us a random sample of 100,000 online players off their site. And what we did, we actually took 5,000 of these players that had actually set time and money limits during a 3-month period. And what we wanted to do was to see what effect limit setting behavior had on these particular types of gamblers. And on this particular platform is that people could actually set both time limits and monetary limits. Now, the thing I ought to stress about this particular study is that the time and money limits here were voluntarily set by the players. This wasn't something mandatory. And so that's why we had a much smaller sample of 5,000 online gamblers that we took from this that had actually set their voluntary limits. And from these 5,000 gamblers, we also wanted to look at particularly what we call the most gambling intense players. And we used a metric called theoretical loss. And theoretical loss is basically the amount that somebody gambles multiplied by the probability of winning on that particular event. What we actually found was that voluntary spending limits had a different effect on different types of players. So for instance, in terms of spending limits, it was actually the casino players and the lottery players that actually got most benefit from setting voluntary monetary spending limits. But actually amongst poker players, we actually found that those gamblers, if they actually set a time limit, that was actually far more efficacious for them in terms of being able to control their gambling. And the highest significant decrease in playing duration was actually amongst the poker players after they'd actually set a voluntary duration playing limit. So really the results of this study showed, and say this was the first ever study we did on limit setting, is that it demonstrated that voluntary limit setting had a very specific and significant effect on the gamblers that we studied. It did seem to be that those who most needed to set their limits, i.e. the 10% of most gambling intense players, it actually did help them in terms of reducing the time and money that they spent. And it does appear that voluntary limit, that this study shows that voluntary limit setting has the appropriate effect, because really what we want to do is obviously enjoy, maximize the fun for those who don't necessarily need to be setting limits, and having limits for those who most need it, i.e. the most gambling intense players. Now, since we carried out that study way back in 2013, we've now published another 4 studies looking at limit setting. One of our more recent studies was a study looking at kindred data, and this is actually one of the biggest studies that we've done, and it's probably one of the biggest studies that have been done in the gambling studies field, because this had a data set of over 175,000 online gamblers that were supplied to us by kindred data. And what we did here, we wanted to look at the effect of limit setting over a particular time period. And as I say, what we looked at here was we looked at all gambling between January 2016 and May 2017, so a period for over a year. And the data set that we were given by Kindred, this was a random sample of about 20% of that data set. And what we did here, we divided the sample into 10 different playing intensity groups, from obviously the top 10% most gambling intense down to the lowest 10% of gambling intense players. And what we actually found is that the percentage of active players in the first quarter of 2017 was actually, statistically significantly higher amongst those group of players who actually set voluntary money limits in the first quarter of 2016, compared to those gamblers who had not. And what this really interestingly for us suggests is that players who actually set their own voluntary spending limits are actually more loyal to that company than those who do not. So for us, it actually makes sense for gambling companies to try and get their players to voluntarily set limits, because it does seem to have an impact on loyalty. Another study we did again with kindred data, slightly smaller sample size here, with nearly 50,000 online players, again supplied by Kindred. Here we wanted to look at the effect of limit setting and longer term spending. And what we found in this particular study is that amongst the most gambling intense players, those who set voluntary limits actually gambled significantly less money a year later compared to those who are not. So those with, what we call this highest gambling intensity, they were also more like, it's those that with the highest gambling intensity are more likely to be problem gamblers. So the fact that this study showed that over the long term spending was actually reduced, again suggests to me is that limit setting is actually a responsible gambling tool that works. Another interesting study that we did, and this was from data supplied by the Norwegian gaming operator Norsk Tipping. This was a study where we actually tried to look at what kinds of behavior are actually important in getting people to set limits in the first place. This was actually an algorithm study that we use, and as I say, very large sample size here, over 70,000 online gamblers. And what this particular study found, it was actually possible to demonstrate that there are particular behaviors that seem to predict future limit setting behavior by the players. We looked at 33 different variables within our research, and we found that the most important variables that actually were predictive of people setting their own voluntary limit was players who received a message from Norsk Tipping say that they've reached 80% of their personal monthly global loss limit. And Norsk Tipping are one of the very few companies that have a mandatory global loss limit. So every month players cannot lose more than 20,000 kroner, which is roughly around 2,000 euros. But other parameters that actually were predictors of setting a voluntary limit was people who had set a personal monthly loss limit, the amount that they bet, the theoretical loss, this metric of the amount that you're prepared to risk times the probability of winning, and whether the players had actually increased their limits in the past. But again, from our perspective, this does still suggest that limit setting is an effective tool. Now, another type of responsible gambling tool is the use of pop-ups. and we've done 2 studies that have looked at whether pop-ups can be used to actually stop people gambling. Now, the reason we think our studies are very important is because there have been 5 or 6 studies done in laboratory situations, all showing that if you show a pop-up message while people are gambling, is that in an experimental laboratory situation, that pop-up message does seem to get people to stop their gambling. Now, the problem with these studies is that they're not very big sample sizes. So I think the largest experimental study that has looked at pop-ups in a laboratory situation is just 72 people. So we actually did a study where we actually investigated a pop-up message in real time with real gamblers on a real gambling site. This was, again, the Austrian company Win Today. And what we did in this particular study, we compared the behavioral tracking data of 2 representative random samples of 400,000 gambling sessions before and after a very simple pop-up message actually was introduced by the company. And the pop-up message basically said, you've now been playing over 1,000, sorry, you've now played over 1,000 consecutive slot games. Would you like to carry on? And the answer was, they could press yes or no on that particular button. And in this particular study, this actually had around about 50,000 online gamblers in this particular study. Of those 50,000 online gamblers, there was only about 10,000 sessions that actually reached 1,000 consecutive plays, and 1,000 consecutive plays is around about an hour of playing. What our study showed was that there was a demonstrable difference between the before and after the pop-up message was introduced. However, I do want to say, although there was a statistically significant difference here, is the number of sessions that actually stopped. And remember, there were approximately 10,000 sessions that occurred here. Is that only 45 sessions were actually stopped when people saw this message. So what that actually said to us is that pop-up messages trying to get people to stop when they've been playing for an hour on an online slot machine don't tend to work. We then did another study. This was actually a much larger study, but we wanted to actually change the message because we thought the message that the gambling operator used was very simple. So we actually used theory relating to self-appraisal feedback, normative feedback, cognitive belief feedback. And so we did this second study, which was twice as big as the first study. And what we did here, as I say, we changed the message completely. And we had a much, much longer message here. And the message said is that we would like to inform you that you have just played 1,000 slot games. Only a few people play more than 1,000 slot games. The chance of winning does not increase with the duration of the session. Taking a break often helps, and you can choose the duration of the break. Now, the reasoning behind that message was that if you look, we just break down the message. The first part of the message says, we would like to inform you that you've just played 1,000 slot games. So this is just objectively informing the players about the behavior that they've actually engaged in. The second part of the message, only a few people play more than 1,000 slot games. Well, this provides what we call normative feedback. It's telling players about what other players are doing, because if you want to enable behavioral change, actually telling people and informing them what other players do is quite likely to help them change their own behavior. So in fact, we know that only 1.5% of playing sessions exceed this 1,000 consecutive slot games. The next bit of the message, the chance of winning doesn't increase with the duration of session. That's just basically trying to address a particular cognitive misbelief amongst gamblers, the gambler's fallacy. And we also, this last bit, taking a break often helps, and you can choose the duration of break. That's actually giving people a bit of advice. Now, what we actually found in this study is here, as a much bigger study, we looked at 1.6 million game sessions, and we looked at 800,000 sessions using the very simple pop-up message versus what we call this enhanced pop-up message that we redesigned. This study had about 70,000 online gamblers, and we hypothesized that our new message would actually cause an increase in the amount of people to stop gambling once they'd seen the message. What we actually found is that using the very simple pop-up message, here only 75 sessions out of 11,232 actually stopped gambling when they saw that message. So actually only 0.67%. With our new enhanced message, we did significantly increase the amount of people. Here we got 169 sessions stopping out of 11,878 sessions, but that was actually still only 1.39% of the sessions. So again, what that is actually telling us, compared to all the experimental evidence, real gamblers in real time on a real gambling platform, when they see a message asking them to stop after they've been playing for about an hour, playing an online slot machine, very, very few sessions actually stop. And again, what you see here is that the enhanced message, again, significantly increased the amount of people that stopped, but unfortunately, the actual numbers of people that stopped was very, very low. And the final types of responsible gambling tool that we've looked at is looking at what we call these mandatory play breaks. Now we've done 2 studies here, and so the one that we've had published so far was published at the end of 2019. This was done with Norsk Tipping, the Norwegian operator, and they gave us access to over 7,000 video lottery terminal players. And that's, these 7,000 plus players generated well over 200,000 playing sessions that we could look at. And what we wanted to look at is what happened after people had had this forced termination, this mandatory break. And on this particular study, the mandatory breaks only lasted 90 seconds. So basically, once somebody had been playing for a whole hour on the Norsk Tipping online platform, is the site would close down for 90 seconds and people couldn't carry on until they'd had this mandatory play break. Unfortunately, what our results showed is that there were no significant differences in terms of the amount of money that people staked in the subsequent session after this 90-second play break. Now, this may have been a design fault in terms of the way we looked at it, but we've actually just done another study where we've compared, and Norsk Tipping allowed us to do this again. They actually compared 3 types of mandatory break: a 90-second break, a 5-minute break, and a 15-minute break. That paper was actually accepted this week, so it's actually going to be out in a few weeks' time. And what we actually found there is that the people who had a 15-minute break did actually significantly reduce the amount of money they spent on gambling after a 15-minute break compared to the 90-second break and the 5-minute break. So my conclusions, what I've tried to do, and obviously this has been a whiz-bang tour through some of the more favorite studies that we've done using behavioral tracking data, is that behavioral tracking data, we think, is an innovative method in evaluating responsible gambling tools. Second thing is that, while behavioral tracking research has many advantages, it's not without its problems. I mean, one of the biggest problems we have, of course, is that even though we have these very large sample sizes, is that these are unrepresentative players, because these are players only at that particular, gambling site. The other problem we have, of course, is that we don't necessarily have the totality of people's gambling behavior. We only have their behavioral data at that particular site. And obviously there are lots of gamblers that are not loyal to one particular gambling platform. And if they're gambling on obviously 2 or more gambling platforms, then we're not seeing the totality of their behavior. In terms of what I think our research has shown, is that we think that responsible gambling tools that use a player's tracking data can help some, but I do have to stress here, not all players. So even though we've shown there are statistically significant differences in being able to reduce the amount of money that people spend, it doesn't work equally across all gamblers. And of course, there'll always be some gamblers where these particular responsible gambling tools just don't work at all. But in terms of what I think, the most important finding is, it does seem to be that providing feedback to players, actually based on their actual playing behavior, has great potential to help gamblers actually gamble more responsibly. And anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Say thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've got lots of questions for me.